Bless you. So we talked all about pollination and reproductive parts within a flower last week. The one we didn't get to this mimicry slide, which is sort of interesting. We talked about how flowers attract their pollinators, and through nectar, through their colors, through scents. But one thing that some plants have evolved is sort of a form of mimicry, where the flower actually mimics an organism. So some plants have evolved so they actually look like an insect. Okay. Here you have some examples. These are the petals, the modified petals of these flowers. And they've evolved to look like an insect to their pollinators, so that males will visit the flowers thinking it's a female and attempts to mate with this fake female, okay, that the petals are mimicking, and in the process they get pollen on them and they actually pollinate the flower. So they think they're reproducing for themselves when actually they're doing the reproduction for the plants. So that's just sort of an interesting take on it. All right. So once flowers form, the reproductive structures mature, pollination takes place. A pollen grain, a sperm cell from a pollen grain has fertilized an egg cell in the ovule. Then it starts to form a seed. So that's the next step. And a seed is really equivalent to an embryo. Like an animal has an embryo growing, a seed is an embryo of a plant. It has a few parts that we'll be talking about. Okay. So the seed is what forms once the ovule is fertilized. But it won't form until then. And it has a few different things inside of it. Okay. Often these seeds will form inside of fruits depending on the plant. So inside of a seed, there's a few things. There's the actual embryo of the plant, a tiny little, basically baby plant inside of a seed. Then you have the bulk of the seed, which is basically stored food, stored energy, often a starchy substance. That this embryo, because when this seed starts to grow, starts to germinate, it needs a lot of energy to begin that growth. It's not able to start getting food through photosynthesis until it can start to grow, absorb water, poke out of the soil, grow leaves, and so forth. So until it can get to that point, it relies on energy that's stored in the seed. And then it's all wrapped in a protective layer called the seed coat. So that's what a seed is. And so we use lots of seeds as food. Beans, for example, are seeds. And the part, if you eat a bean, the part that you're actually eating, the starchy part, is all of this. Okay, peanuts are seeds. Again, the part of the peanut you're actually eating. You know how if you imagine like a roasted peanut, like it breaks in half? And then there's that little other section that breaks off. What's that other section? Nope. Because the seed coat's like that. Like, those red peanuts, they have like that stuff around them. That's the seed coat. Most of the peanut is this cotyledon, this stored up energy. But the other little section is the dried up little embryo of that seed. If we grind up wheat seeds, what do we get?
Oatmeal. No, that's good.
Flour. Flour is ground up wheat seeds. In actual flour is all of this stored up starch. If you get white flour, it's just this starch. If you get whole wheat flour, it's the starch, the seed coat, and that little embryo, all ground up together to make the flour. All right, so it's important in plants for seeds to be dispersed. What would be the problem if a plant produced seeds and they just fall to the ground and start to grow? Why is that not great? Richard?
Could be a giant cluster then, they would fight each other.
Yeah, they'd be competing for water from the soil, for nutrients from the soil, for sunlight. Wouldn't really make any sense for new plants to grow right underneath the existing plants. Okay? So most plants have means of dispersing their seeds, getting their seeds somewhere else. Okay? And so there's there's lots of ways plants have their seeds dispersed. We'll talk about some of the important ones, and you're familiar with a lot of these. First of all, wind is often an important means of seed dispersal. What plant do these seeds come from? You've all seen them. You've thrown them in the air, watched them fall to the ground.
Helicopter.
What are they? Where do you find them? What type of trees? Only one type of tree. Yeah?
Oak. Pine.
Oaks produce what?
Well, acorns.
Acorns.
Oh,
Pine trees.
no,
Pine cones.
it's in Stardew Valley.
These are from maple trees.
Oh.
Those are maple seeds.
And it's Stardew
Okay.
Valley.
And again, what they do is once the seed forms, this part develops, and as they fall off of the maple tree, what happens? They start spinning. And then as wind currents pick up, they can carry them pretty far if the wind's picked up, and then they start to grow in a new area. Usually, seeds dispersed by wind are pretty light. Another example, a dandelion. When you take a dandelion and you blow the white fuzzy stuff, those are actually, each of those little fuzzes has a seed attached to it. And that fuzz that forms is an adaptation to seed dispersal. So if you kick those white parts of the dandelions, you blow on them, you're just spreading their seeds throughout the rest of your lawn.
So do the yellow ones turn into white ones?
Yep. Yeah, the yellow is before what?
They make the seeds.
Yes. Yeah, yellow's before pollination. Once those individual flowers are pollinated, those individual seeds form, it turns that white fluffy stuff, and the seeds are dispersed.
What if there's no wind? And
Then they just fall to the ground, they may start growing there and compete with each other, but usually the wind will pick them up. Because usually they'll stay like relatively intact until the wind picks up and starts to blow them away. Some plants are adapted to seed dispersal via water. What is this? That's a coconut. Coconuts float. The coconuts drop into the water, often on coastal areas, float around, eventually they'll wash up somewhere and begin growing.
So what's like the coconut up there? Is it that food store?
Yeah, it's like the coconut, like the white meat of the coconut is like that starchy stored up food. Some plants burst, dispersing their seeds. I don't know if you're familiar with them. You find them around here all the time, especially in wet areas. Okay, might be called jewelweed or jewelweed is what I've heard it called, snapdragons. And they grow, when they mature, they form seeds in these little pods and they kind of swell up. And then if you touch the pods, they basically explode and they send their seeds flying out. That's how they disperse. Here you can see, has anyone ever seen these?
No.
If somebody points them out to you, you'll then see them all over. They're very common. So here you see this guy just touches the pod,
Whoa.
basically springs open, explodes, sending the seeds all over. And one of the most common means of seed dispersal is by animals.
Oh, that's four. Right.
So, yeah, is yours a little?
Yeah,
Yeah,
three.
three.
On the bottom of the page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
yeah.
wrote that.
Yeah, things change a little bit. Three's on that side. So animals often help in seed dispersal, and it can happen in a couple ways. Often seeds are inside of fruits, and as an animal eats the fruit, because they're full of sugar and starch, and they're a good source of food for lots of animals. So as animals consume the fruit, they also consume the seeds. Okay? Those seeds don't break down in the stomach. They pass through the digestive system of the animal. But By the time they pass through the digestive system, it's in a different place. And those seeds are dispersed into the ground. Okay? So fruit is sort of attracted, it's a reward for the animal, and it helps to disperse those seeds. Yeah, there's some changes. You could. Yeah. Some seeds have burrs on them, like you're familiar with burdocks, right? You've seen these. Okay, this is another means of seed dispersal. These burdocks have seeds inside of them. They get attached. They cling to an animal's fur. Eventually, they fall off, and the seeds have been dispersed. Some animals take seeds, bury them, and forget about them. And they eventually can grow into seeds. Things like acorns and stuff like this. Yeah, they don't always find them all though, or need them all. So basically, anything with seeds inside of it is technically a fruit. The fruit forms from the ripened ovary after pollination has taken place. Okay? So, what? Cucumber is a fruit. A pepper is a fruit. A tomato is a fruit. A banana is a fruit. If it has seeds inside of it, it's a fruit. Yes. What's a vegetable? Carrot. Onion. Where do those things come from?
The ground.
No, not necessarily the ground, but they're not the fruits like lettuce are the leaves of a plant. Potato is an underground tuber of a plant. So those come from other parts of the plants, not the ripened ovaries.
Is an avocado?
Yep, that's a seed inside of an avocado. All right, so often fruits are brightly colored, they're tasty, there's lots of energy for the animal to attract the animal. And those seeds pass through the digestive system and then eventually get pooped out in a different area.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot of
So,
seeds.
that's a lot of seeds, right? That's bear poop, probably like raspberries or something, blackberries. Fox poop, lots of animals eat fruits.
Why does only one of them?
That guy's touching it.
So do you know what this is? This is Kopi Luwak. Anyone know what Kopi Luwak is?
No. If you say rice.
No. It is, I don't know if it still is, but it's, I think, the most expensive coffee that you can buy is Kopi Luwak. It comes from, it's about $200 a pound. It comes from a civet which eats the coffee berries, the fruits of a coffee tree, digests them, eventually poops them out. People gather up these seeds that have been through the digestive system of the civet, roast them, grind them into coffee, and I've never drunk it, but it's the most expensive coffee. It's like prized, obviously.
Is this like something that you buy but don't drink?
No, people buy it. You can buy a cup of Kopi Luwak coffee.
Is it
Like Starbucks?
They sell different places, like high-end coffee places. You can buy it sometimes.
$200 per.
All right, no, not Dunkin' Donuts. Coffee's not Kopi Luwak. So tell me, are these things fruits? Hey, that's okay. Just sort of curious. You know, you ever have somebody always says, "Well, guess what? A tomato's actually not a vegetable; it's a fruit." You know.
And then there's
And they're correct. They're technically correct. So, corn, fruit?
Yeah.
No.
No. It's a starch.
It is a fruit. They're seeds. The seed is inside of a corn kernel. The corn kernel itself is the fruit. A banana?
Yes.
Eggplant?
Yes.
Okay. Tomato?
Yes.
Pear?
Yes.
Pepper?
Yes.
Carrot?
No.
No. What is a carrot?
Vegetable.
It's a root, yes. Zucchini?
Yes.
Green beans?
Yes.
Chestnuts?
Yes.
Yep. So, many things that we consider, nuts or vegetables are technically fruits. Because again, What was this part of the tomato? Those are the sepals, right? That's where this was attached. That was the sepal. What was this?
The flower.
No, well, what part of the flower?
Ovary.
That's the whole thing is the ovary, because inside, what were these? Ovules. Okay? Those were ovules.
Where's the style?
So the style would have been, is at this end, okay, and the stigma, it sort of forms into the fruit. Okay, the stamens, after they mature, they just fall off. Okay, the petals just fall off. And you're left, after pollination, the stamens, the petals usually fall off, and the ovary starts growing into the fruit. All right. So we don't need to watch this. I want to watch the pollination. So what happens after these seeds are eventually dispersed? They grow. We call the growth of the seeds germination. Okay? Germination is when a plant grows from the seed. And if you've planted seeds, you can buy them at Home Depot or the grocery store. They sell seeds in a packet, and they don't grow there because why don't they grow? They're in those packets. Drew?
Oh, they have no source of water or light?
Yeah, they don't have the proper conditions. Seeds are dormant until proper conditions are reached, and then they begin their growth. Okay? And seeds can be in that dormant stage for years until they begin to grow. Okay? So there's lots of different things that are required. So water is an important part of seed germination, because once they are wet and absorb some of that water, that softens the seed coat around the outside. It activates enzymes within the seed that's going to start to break down the starch so the plant can use it. They require oxygen as well. Again, to break down this starchy material, the seeds need to go through respiration, and that requires oxygen. They need the proper temperature as well. Enzymes only work in a range of temperatures, and if they're not at the right temperature, they will not germinate. And so you see here like the stages of germination. And we'll look at it here. You start, the seed gets wet. It starts to swell up. Okay, the seed coat breaks. Oops, sorry. And then oxygen starts to be able to get in and break down this starchy stored up food. The root emerges, it's called the radicle, starts growing downward into the soil, starts absorbing water. The stem starts to elongate, eventually breaks through the soil. The stored up food is called the cotyledons. They stay intact as the energy gets used up. And then the first leaves begin to emerge. And once those leaves can emerge, that's when it starts to go through photosynthesis, start making its own food, and not relying on the stored up food that was in the seed.
How do the first seeds?
They just grow. So they start to develop from cells that are there in that embryo, and they grow using up the energy from the starchy part of the food stored up. All right, finish up here with asexual reproduction, I guess. So pollination and what we've been talking about is sexual reproduction in plants. We have pollen from one plant fertilizing ovules in another plant. We're mixing genes from two different organisms to form the offspring. That's sexual reproduction, adds variety to the species. However, plants also can reproduce asexually as well. So we know asexual means without, so without sex, and the offspring we know are identical to their parent. There's only one parent organism involved. The offspring are copies. There's lots of ways plants do this naturally, and there's also ways of humans do this to plants. One example is something called a rhizome. Grass grows through rhizomes. Basically, it grows a stem underground and then pops up a new plant every once in a while that produces leaves, and those plants are just clones of the original. the same sort of thing happens, but if it's above ground, it's called a runner. Strawberries do this. They grow an above ground stem sideways. When it touches the soil, some bare soil, that grows roots and it starts to become a new plant. But again, they're all identical to each other. They're just copies of the original. So why would plants reproduce? So we said sexual reproduction results in variation. That's generally good for the species. So why would plants also reproduce asexually? What are the benefits of that? Mateo?
If you're already perfectly adapted.
Yeah, if you're well adapted, if conditions are good, then more of that is good. It's also quicker, right? Doesn't require, pollen to transfer here to there, or fruit to grow, and then the seed to be dispersed. So plants can reproduce and colonize an area much more quickly asexually. The disadvantage is that the offspring are identical. There's no new variation. So if you have a whole bunch of identical plants, and a disease can affect one of them is susceptible to that disease, then they're all going to be susceptible to that disease. And that's a problem. Wipe out the whole area. So that's a disadvantage. People use asexual propagation of plants, oftentimes in agriculture, landscaping, things like that. One interesting thing is called grafting. You can actually take two different types of plants and kind of graft them together. You take one plant, it's called the scion, the top part of the plant. You sort of carve it into a point, like a branch of it. You take the stock, it could be a whole different species. You cut a slit in it, you put them together, wrap them up, they have tape they use to do this. And what will happen is the vascular tissue will grow back together and it will continue growing. And you could graft two types of plants onto one. Here's an example of this being done. In this tree, they've taken one plant and grafted onto it both a peach branch and a plum branch. Once they sort of heal and begin growing, now you have a tree that can produce peaches and plums on one tree.
I saw this thing that was like you cut off the end of a banana and a kiwi, and then if you plant them together, they will grow a kiwi inside of the banana. That actually happens.
I don't know about that. Here you have two different types of apples growing on one stem. There are some plants you could buy them. They have 4 or 5 citrus fruits all growing on one rootstock. You can plant them, you can buy them. So this is sometimes done in agriculture.
So could you grow the plant for like a seed?
No, because the seeds produced from these apples would be like Granny Smith apples. The seeds produced here would grow into Red Delicious apples. These seeds would grow into plums, these seeds would grow into peaches. So no, you would have to regraft them. Also, you may, in your landscape, in your house, does anyone have like one of these umbrella trees where it grows straight and then the top, like the branches all sort of hang and droop down? If you ever go look closely at that, if you look underneath the little umbrella part, those are made by grafting two different plants onto each other. They take, I don't know what the exact plants are. I think top might be a wood. No, it's not a
Cherry
wood.
tree.
Okay, so they graft one plant that grows a very straight stem, and onto that they graft a droopy branch plant that forms that. And if you look under it, you can see where the graft was. Because when it heals, there's sort of an enlarged area where the graft was put in, and you can sort of see it. There are some plants that are carnivorous. I'm sure you've heard of these. And the carnivorous plants are still autotrophic. So plants are autotrophic, all plants, okay? So they make their own food, using photosynthesis, even these plants. So why do they capture insects? They capture insects because they often grow in very nutrient-poor soils. You often find these in bogs, swamps, marshes, where there's not a lot of nutrients in the soil. So they need nitrogen or phosphorus and potassium. So what happens is they have light, they make their own food, but they don't have those minerals. They get those minerals by trapping insects, breaking them down, and absorbing the nitrogen or phosphorus from them. Come in different varieties. What's this? That's a Venus flytrap. Those are called snap traps, traps that close quickly to trap their prey. You know what this is? No. This is a sundew plant. And they have like a sticky sort of resin on them that trap the insect and then curl up and digest it. These are pitcher plants. They're called pitfall traps because the insects get into them and can't get out. I actually saw these in the wild. I never have seen them until this summer.
Smell bad?
No, they don't smell bad. Saw them in the Adirondacks when we were camping. Let me see. We'll watch it. Whoops. What do we have on? Just tropism? Yeah, we might as well just finish up. Then we can watch all the videos at one time. So plants can grow, usually, in response to stimuli. We don't really think about it because it happens relatively slowly, but we call these tropisms. The movement or growth of a plant in response to a stimulus. And there are several types of tropisms that are common in plants. One is called phototropism. You know what that is? Growth in response to what? Light. Photo means light. If you ever had a plant in a window, what happens? It doesn't just grow straight up. It grows towards the window. Hydrotropism? Water. Roots of a plant will grow in the direction where there's a source of water. Gravitotropism?
Down.
Gravity. Roots grow down. Stems grow up. Thigmotropism, one you probably won't get. This is a response to touch. Some plants, when you're touched, they sort of curl up, or they grow around something that they're in contact with.
Is that like the carnivorous?
Yes. So here we have an example of what kind of tropism. Gravitotropism. Pots on its side, but stems growing upward. What about, so you could grow plants and they'll grow towards sunlight, gravity, thigmo, growing towards a water source, growing in response to contact with something. So, yeah, there's some neat videos here. They're all time-lapse, obvious, or most of them are time-lapse because you have this, that happens relatively slowly. So